So, preflop, flop, turn, and river, the four betting streets. Now that we've gone over the four pillars of mastery and their relevance in problem solving, we must layer them on top of the streets of betting and ask the critical question of how to use them to our advantage. The 10 axioms which were developed in conjunction with the four pillars of mastery continue to shed light here, but only scratch the surface as one would expect. Our goal is to continue to combine these ideas as we move along in this discourse, ultimately leading to a systematized understanding of the game. This systematized understanding will leverage our ability to problem solve any situation on the fly, which is really what we need to be able to do. Without further ado, let us break down the streets of betting and what exactly we should be asking ourselves when deciding how to approach our decisions. Preflop. Before we get into what to ask ourselves when choosing what to do preflop, let us first address the nature of the blinds themselves. If you do not already know, ask yourself, why do the blinds exist and what is their purpose in the game overall? And you can take a moment to do that right now. And the reason that the blinds exist is because they encourage action. You can imagine a game where no blinds exist and no players play any hands. And the reason that this is not trivial to understand is because every action at the table is predicated on those blinds being posted. So from that first initial preflop raise to, a big river all in, everything starts from the posting of the big blind and, potentially an ante, as well as the small blind, and the players fighting over that dead money. That is really a very critical thing to understand. It's kind of like the poker big bang, if you will. Anyway, with that out of the way, questions to ask ourselves pre-flop when we are problem solving and figuring out how we actually should conceptualize our strategy. What is my position? What are stack sizes? I'm sure you see a trend here. What are opponents' ranges? Which actions and raise sizes are best for my range? So now we're getting into this more acute idea of taking ranges and figuring out what we actually want to do with them. So the first step is figuring out what those ranges are. The next step is then figuring out kind of how do those ranges actually want to play? Like, what are their incentives? The next step is, where is my hand in my range? So we've kind of done a lot of exploration before we now arrive at this decision point where we're taking the practical consideration of what do I actually have in this situation and sort of, can I play this hand profitably being the next bullet point here. Really deciding how it is that we want to play in this situation. There's quite a bit to consider before we actually get to that stage. And the reason is because there are so many variables at the table and they're all going to impact what it is that we need to consider. This is why when we share hand histories in order to get the best feedback, we have to include the blinds, the stage of the tournament, the positions of the players, the action sequences, and then, that's just sort of even scratching the surface as it is. Player tendencies, timing tells, physical reads, any sort of intuitive qualities that are layered on top, and so on and so forth. Stuff that we will get into later, but we're really just building a very basic foundation right now. And it may seem as if it's rather abstract in some cases, but this is, in my opinion, the best way to go about such things. Lastly, here we have, how did remaining preflop action impact ranges? And as we spoke about earlier in the range composition and analysis section, we want to allow our understanding of ranges to be an ongoing fluid process throughout a hand. As previously noted as well, the ranges are always diminishing, they are never expanding. So flop. Once we've made it to the flop, it is imperative to realize that we are 25% of the way through the hand, and that the betting streets are both finite and foreknown. This is critical because we have to consider both the ramifications of how playing passively or aggressively will impact future betting streets, as well as our range. And we did mention this earlier also. The impact here is when we start to consider the idea of splitting our ranges. And the idea of splitting ranges is taking different subsets of a range, or probably more accurately, uh, taking those different subsets and splitting the subsets. So, taking some of our good hands, choosing some action with them, generally either passive or aggressive, choosing some of our middling and bottom strength hands, and figuring out how those hands want to fit into that split of passive or aggressive. And the reason this matters is because when we are considering how our range looks on future streets, we need to consider the fact that because of the minimization or the diminishing components of a range as we move throughout a hand and navigate the different streets and take the different betting actions or player actions, uh, when certain hands are removed from what we can possibly have, that will impact our ability to properly defend against our opponent's aggression and also play aggressively ourselves. So I'm going to put a pin in that for now, but we're going to get back to that point soon. That being said, on the flop, what is the stack to pot ratio? What is the board texture? Who has equity advantage or range advantage? Is the equity distribution of ranges static or dynamic? And how about for our hand? So this touches on something that was mentioned earlier as well, the dynamicism of a board. On a board, like let's just pick something 3, 4, 7, 8 with 2 flush draws, there are a lot of rivers that can change what the best possible hand is. Half the deck is going to complete a flush in one way or another. Many cards are overcards. Many cards complete straights, so on and so forth. So on boards like that, we tend to want to bet bigger when we are betting in most cases. On boards that are more locked down, something like ace, ace, 4, 4, an ace is going to, in most cases, be the nuts on the river unless a 4 comes, or, the rare case where someone has an ace with a kicker and pairs that kicker and improves their aces full of 4s to aces full of jacks or something. And that's significant because that is really what's going to inform our desire to bet certain sizes, because our need to protect our equity and the foresight of whether or not we will retain that equity will be part and parcel of what encourages us to put chips in the pot and how many to put in the pot. What actions and sizes are best for my range? We kind of just covered that there. Does my hand have different preferences than my range? So I often refer to this idea of what's good for the goose is good for the gander in context of figuring out what our hand wants to do relative to our range overall. And our hand is the goose and our range is the gander. And in many cases, it's far more likely that what our range wants to do will somewhat be reflected in our hand's preferences. Now, certain hands will have stronger preferences than range, otherwise there would be no distinguishing components between hands and range. But if you're ever unsure, then you can often reference like what might be sort of a global quality of the range and use that to inform what your hand specifically might want to do. And then lastly, again, how did the remaining flop actions affect ranges? As we mentioned, range analysis is something that continues throughout the course of a hand. The turn is just that, a turn. It's the turning point in a hand where you have to make a decision on how to proceed with your hand and your range. Very often a fork in the road appears, and we must now choose which direction is appropriate for us. The turn is where things start to become serious, as we are now nearly at the end, or on the river and nearing showdown, or just the end of the betting streets. And this is relevant because once we get to the turn, ranges have narrowed significantly. We're halfway through the hand. And when we start to consider this idea of polarized betting strategies, the turn is often going to be a case where that starts to become more significant. It becomes even more significant on the river relatively speaking. And that's just something to keep in mind because it's really important to understand, again, what we're accomplishing with our bets. So as we give practical examples, again, this will all get further fleshed out, but right now we're still just setting the stage. So again, what is the stack to pot ratio? How do the turn cards shift equities of ranges? This is the dynamicism component realized. How did the nature of the board texture change? Did draws complete? Did it board pair? Did overcards come out? So on and so forth. Who has the nut advantage? And this is something that is relevant for all streets of betting, but particularly so, I felt it was worthwhile to include on the turn. This is if we consider the top, let's say, 5 to 10% of equity holdings in a certain range. Those are going to be what the top of range or nut part of the range entail. And when you have a significant advantage over your opponent in the top end of the range, this is where we're going to be able to, I'll say exploit, but it's not that our opponent has done anything wrong in some cases. It's just that we get to take advantage of this sort of gift we've been given due to the range composition. And that will often allow us to pressure our opponent very significantly. It's even more so when we have a range advantage and we have the nut advantage. So we have an advantage on the whole, and then we have an advantage in this very top end, which is specific to our best holdings. How our range is competitive at the top, middle, and bottom. So it's not just always the case that we have a nut advantage, as mentioned. Sometimes we will have advantages at the middle and bottom of the range as well. And how do we split our ranges? This is really where the idea of splitting ranges comes to life on the turn, because particularly true in position, we really need to be cognizant of the fact that reopening the action, and this is especially true as stack sizes diminish. So I want that to really resonate with everybody. As stack sizes diminish, the splitting of ranges becomes sort of more relevant and significant because it's easy to overlook the fact that we put in a significant portion of the effective stacks on the turn and fail to acknowledge what that will do both to our range that arrives at the river when we take a passive action, to the specific hands that we put into that aggressive range, and really how our opponent will respond and what that means for us. So this is true at all stack sizes, but particularly so at shorter stack depths. It can be a bit dangerous to overlook the relevant aspects of considering our range on the whole and meticulously choosing which hands we want to put into those different buckets of action sequences. And the way I think about this is, we have this range overall. We can consider the subsets. Let's just take top, middle, and bottom for sake of ease. The top of our range, and we're going to, get into this again later. I kind of keep mentioning that, but everything is connected. If I started with the other stuff, I'd say we're going to get into this stuff in a bit as well. So the value portion of our range is really what's always driving our ability and willingness to play aggressively. And as we do so, we need to consider what other parts of our range nicely fill in those gaps. Now, unless our entire range is playing aggressively, what happens to the part of our range that isn't? Well, it's up to us to accurately fill in that bucket of the more passive action sequence with some of our very strong hands as well. Very strong, probably an overstatement, but hands which can defend against aggression comfortably due to the fact that a lot of our strong hands have gone into this other bucket. And if you ever heard the idea of protecting your range, this is very much part and parcel of that. So given how ranges are split, what are our river considerations for each range? This touches at the heart of having the foresight for, how are different cards, different runouts going to affect the way that our range wants to play, and what that means for our strategies that have yet to materialize. And lastly, with split ranges, where does our hand belong? And you can see once again that the practical, like what do I have here and what am I actually doing? It's really the end of the chain of of command, more or less. We need to consider kind of what is possibly happening before we decide what is actually happening. And I can't stress enough how important it is to kind of draw your mind back and as best you can see that whole picture, see the landscape of what is going on here in the most holistic sense possible. What are all of the elements that are going into this scenario or this situation? And only once we've done that can we then see like, oh, okay, my hand is over here or my hand is over there. Um, Perhaps somewhat of a loose analogy with the idea of a landscape, but this is very much how I think about the aspect of range building, strategic considerations, and the foresight of what will happen in the future, as well as right now, like how am I actually deciding what I want to do with my range? It's like your range is really it's kind of like the Rubik's cube you've been given, and how can you position it such that it's appropriate to unlock the necessary components of what that situation is asking of you. So sometimes you're going to want one side of that Rubik's cube to be entirely red. Sometimes you're going to want a mix of red and yellow. Sometimes you want some green in there or whatever. But that is really the way to think about this abstract big picture idea of range building. And the turn is really a place where this materializes in a very distinct fashion. And lastly, here we are on the river. The river is both the most challenging and most critical street to play correctly. Equity distributions have now fully concretized, and we are at the whim of our abilities to truly play the game. So what does that really mean? Well, no more cards are coming out, right? So while the equity distributions will, in a sense, change based on what our opponent does. So let's say we're in position, our opponent shoves into us. Well, we've again removed certain hands based on, unless they're shoving their entire range, we've removed some hands from what their checking range would have entailed, or maybe a smaller bet than all in. So our range can still, relatively speaking, have an equity fluctuation compared to theirs, but the cards that have come out are no longer changing the dynamic component of the board. Probably a more accurate and helpful way to make that statement. And then we're at the whim of our abilities to truly play the game. We're going to sort of speak about that and the aspect of river play that I think is most critical. A friend once described poker to me as a betting game with cards as opposed to a card game with betting. And I really think this is the river. I love this idea of, poker being a betting game first and foremost, and the cards, I mean, I would say they're secondary, but they come in tandem. But the component of betting and the aspect of tinkering your bet sizes and really playing the game is sort of the best way I can describe it. The more fluid aspect of it's true for all parts of the game tree, but I think this element is highlighted on the river because what tends to happen on the river is you get in these scenarios, at least much more frequently than other parts of the game tree, where you are bluff catching and your opponent either has a better hand or a worse hand. So, if I may make this statement so boldly, poker is not a game where there are many binaries in terms of yes or no or right or wrong. The 1 or 0 aspect of the game is very much highlighted on the river when you're bluff catching. Your opponent is in many cases just going to either have a better hand than you or a worse hand, and that aspect is really highlighted in the snapshot of the game tree. So, what do we ask ourselves on the river? Again, our trusty first question: what is the stack to pot ratio? How did the river card adjust equities of ranges? And I'll mention on the stack to pot ratio before we move to the adjustment of equities. The reason that this is so critical, again, is because of the thresholds and inflection points. Those aspects keep showing up. Remember the idea of the looming all-in that may be coming? Well, now that we've made it to the river, it's significantly more likely that that may happen because the stack to pot ratio tends to be diminished. So the likelihood of an all-in is greater on the river in many cases than it would be on earlier streets. So how did the river card adjust equities of ranges? A very critical question to ask. Did draws complete? Based on the hand reading that we were able to do, who is the card better for? Is it better for our range or our opponent's range? And with that in mind, how are the ranges competitive at the top, middle, and bottom? Once again, we're looking for this comparative component of the ranges between us and that of our opposition. What is your read on or sense of your opponent? This is now getting more into the softer skills and the intangibles. Did our opponent call a turn very quickly? Did they check the river very quickly? What do we feel kind of is happening? And the reason I think this is significant here is because, again, this aspect of poker more so being a betting game with cards as opposed to a card game with betting, and that being highlighted on the river, we want to understand that the modeling that we use is very helpful in understanding what the heuristics are on the river and how that will encourage us to make certain bets or raises based on the hand strength we have, the blocker properties, and our willingness to really delve into the, let's say, strategic considerations. However, there are just going to be cases where you get that sixth sense, and those are sort of the non-strategic components. And the further we move into the hand, the more those things are significant. They are significant the whole way through. The technical components of what makes somebody a great player have a lot more weight pre-flop. They have, a lot of weight on the flop. They have less on turn and river. That's just kind of the nature of it. The heuristics are still very critical in understanding the technique which we use in order to build out our strategies. But that sense, as hands develop, as players get more emotionally invested and literally invested by continuing to stay in the hand, investing more chips, those sort of play into that. So with that in mind, what actions and sizes are best for my range? What actually is the strategy we're looking to employ here with the different hands in our range? How are the river considerations from the turn actualized or adjusted? So, when we consider these dynamic components of board texture changing, how did the board texture change? We sort of covered this with, how did the river card adjust the equities of the ranges? But there will, in some cases just be surprising things that happen where the board texture maybe doesn't change and then our opponent does something that we didn't see coming. That's the nature of poker, right? We're not always going to know what our opponents are going to do, even though we can sometimes be, with relative certainty, within some degree of understanding for likely actions that will follow up based on what cards have come out. And then lastly, what's your gut feeling? Like, truly, what do you feel about this situation? And again, as mentioned, this is a part of the entire game tree, and there will be more content in the future that delves deeper into this, but we're just kind of planting seeds with these ideas right now. The goal of this course is really the more structured framework component of building out an understanding of the game and letting our decisions run through them so that we are able to problem solve using something that has a conceptual framework to run them by.